Hello. Today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about sharpening your prose and some of the common mistakes that writers make. I realize you're all grad students, so going back to kind of some basic grammar stuff may seem a bit tedious. So feel free to just skip this video altogether if you feel like you already know this stuff, or to fast forward through it if this seems too basic for you. But in my experience, what I found is that these are some mistakes that writers commonly make. And so when you're doing the second or third draft of your essay or memoir or journalistic writing, it helps to keep these top 10 tips in mind. So, first of all, you don't have to pay, as I said, attention to this in that first draft. I don't want to kind of plant a whole bunch of other like do's and don'ts in your head that are going to trip you up and stop you from letting the prose flow fluidly. But again, somewhere along the way in the later drafts, these are some issues that you're going to want to look at. Number one, avoid unnecessary qualifiers. So watch for words like about, usually, sometimes, very, around, many, seem to. Usually you can cull these words from your prose and your sentences will be much sharper and more succinct. So for example, it was about 5 p.m. I'd been in the mall since around noon. Instead, it was 5 p.m. I'd been in the mall since noon. Shorter, sharper, more engaging. Another example is the path runs very straight and seems to have been worn smooth by many walkers going through the cotton fields until it reaches almost the center of the field, where it sort of turns and winds around the cotton house and then continues. That would be a bad version of what is, in fact, a lovely sentence by William Faulkner. So the actual sentence reads, the path runs straight as a plumb line, worn smooth by feet and baked brick hard by July, between the green rows of laid-by cotton to the cotton house in the center of the field, where it turns and circles the cotton house at four soft right angles and goes on across the field again, worn so by feet in fading precision. So you can tell there's a beauty and eloquence to the Faulkner version of the sentence that gets very clumped up if you leave in or add qualifiers such as about, seems to, vary, etc. Another tip is to use adverbs sparingly. They're often unnecessary, and if you've got good dialogue and strong verbs, you usually don't need them. So a couple of examples of that. He gestured emphatically. Why not? He shook his fist. So if you've got a better verb there, you don't need that adverb. The pedestrian hurriedly walked across the street. The pedestrian dashed across the street. The boy sat there sadly. The boy pouted through his time out. That's my son at age 2 or 3, by the way. Another suggestion I have, and you may see my comments like this in your, when I'm giving feedback to your work, is delete as implied. In other words, don't overspell things for readers. Make the reader work a little bit harder and to make connections, and they'll be more active and engaged readers. Consider the short story attributed to Hemingway, For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. That was perhaps an apocryphal story about Hemingway, that he scrawled that on a napkin when someone challenged him to write the shortest short story ever. But you can see whether the apocryphal tale is true or not, that those 3 sentences give the reader a lot of room to wonder and try to put the pieces together for themselves. And that applies also to unnecessary words at the sentence level. So, for example, the boy was age 7, just say the boy was 7. And in this photograph, this is from one of our residencies in Bar Harbor, Maine. And I am hiking with another instructor, Debbie Lee. And I saw this sign, please stay on the trail. And you can see Debbie on the trail. So that sign to me is one example that they can delete that as implied, because of course you're going to stay on the trail or you're going to plummet, hundreds of feet to your death. So anyway, that's what I mean by delete as implied. Things are clear without overspelling. Number 4, get the attribution right. Typically the attribution falls after the first sentence or phrase in the quote. So for example, here it says, I can't bear these presentations. If I have to sit through another PowerPoint, I'm going to slit my wrists, she said. Better, I can't bear these presentations, she said. If I have to sit through another PowerPoint, I'm going to slit my wrists. Less is more. So in these cases with attribution or dialogue tags, stick to say, said, asks, asked, as these will do 95% of the time. Avoid things like she exclaimed and she declared. And as for I'm going to slit my wrists, she sighed dejectedly. Yikes. So avoid those if you can. Another one, number 5, is passive voice. That is a pet peeve among editors and certainly a pet peeve of my own. So most of the time you can avoid it. And the reason to avoid it is that it makes for a deadly dull read. So if you've ever been in the midst of reading an academic tract and been finding yourself feeling bored and sleepy and having to read the same sentence over and over to make sense of it, often that's because it's written in passive voice. So let me give you an example. Again, these are things you probably know or learned in school, but maybe haven't paid attention to in a while, and you'd be surprised how often people still make this mistake. It's not a mistake, it's not wrong, but it certainly makes your prose less lively. So an example, the rat was chased by the cat, that's passive. The cat chased the rat, that's active. The tree was hit by lightning, 6 words. Lightning struck the tree, 4 words. So you can see it's sharper and more engaging and active. Some more examples of this are the history exam was passed by Mark. The dog is loved by Rosie. The musical was revered by the critics. In these 3 sentences, you'll notice that the word by often follows the passive verb. And it's not always true, but it's one marker you can look for. And maybe an indicator that there's a passive verb in the mix here that you might want to address and recast the sentence. Another example is you might see a lot of to be, such as am, are, is, was, were, been, being. Here's another example. Passive, the ball was caught by the dog. Active, the dog caught the ball. That's my dog Piper in this picture. Number 6, avoid word repetition. The difference between students was apparent just by sitting in on one class. Apparently, the undergrads understood the lesson while the graduate students remained puzzled. So the apparent there is just clunky and unnecessary. So you want to watch for that. And you may see in the margins my comments WR, that means word repetition. It does not mean never, never repeat words, because there are certainly plenty of instances when writers do that. But what you want to do is make sure that you're using them artfully and intentionally. So, little pop quiz here. Can you guess the author of this sentence who uses repetition quite beautifully? His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. That quote is James Joyce. Another one by James Baldwin that uses repetition. It had something to do with his blackness, I think. He was very black, with his blackness and his beauty, and the fact that he knew he was black but did not know that he was beautiful. Or returning to that Faulkner sentence that we looked at earlier, you'll see that again, the repetition of words in that one. Number 7, watch the over reliance on it was and there is type construction. You can find a way around them because they get tiresome when you use them excessively. Here's an example. It was our first trip to Baltimore and there was so much traffic. We were terrified. Recasting that sentence, in Baltimore for the first time, the onslaught of traffic terrified us. You've trimmed the sentence, you've sharpened it. So watch for ways to do that. And in terms of decoding my comments on your work, you'll often see me highlighting like this, it was, there was, etc. If I feel like you're using that excessively. Another thing you can trim is the I thinks and to me's and it seems. For example, I think politicians are obsessed with their rags to riches narratives versus politicians love their rags to riches stories. So again, you are the author. It is implied that this is what you think. So you do not need to append that. Again, unless you're doing it intentionally to kind of convey doubt about what happened. Like I think it was 1979, but it might have been 1980. Then yes, of course. But for the most part, you can cut those. Another example here, but to me, they all sound the same and are a bit silly versus, but they are all too familiar, trite. Number 9, parallel construction. So in this case, think about Sesame Street, that old song that I'm sure you guys remember. One of these things is not like the other. So remember that each element in the list must work with the sentence stem. So an example of that would be, what is it about this writing conference that keeps authors coming back year after year? Navigating highways, shifting work schedules, and the struggles of personal lives. So you can see that last segment and the struggles of personal lives does not belong with what precedes it or work with the sentence stem. So to correct that, it would be, what is it about this writing conference that keeps authors coming back year after year, navigating highways, shifting work schedules, and juggling family responsibilities? Number 10, don't use sentence fragments. Okay, forget that. Use them intentionally, occasionally, and artfully. So make sure that you're doing it for a reason. So you can break these rules, but do it because you've got a plan and it adds to the eloquence or emphasis, etc., of what you're writing. So here's a fragment from one of the opening chapters of Zadie Smith's White Teeth. The way Archie saw it, country people should die in the country and city people should die in the city. Only proper, in death as he was in life, and all that. So you can see with the only proper, it's good emphasis. It makes us see the speaker and it sounds colloquial and it chops up the rhythm by having this 2-sentence fragment after a very long sentence, and then a second fragment, in death as he was in life, and all that. Okay, bait and switch. I told you it was the top 10 tips, but in fact, I have 12. Um, so the last two, pay attention to your verbs. And I alluded to this earlier when I was saying, if you're relying too heavily on the to be verbs, I am, she was, she is. Take a good look at your verbs and go back and see if you can't snazz them up a bit. Here's an example from a Boston Globe piece by Sarah Schweitzer called The Life and Times of Strider Wolf, in which there were such nice verbs that really impacted the pace and the experience of reading the story about this young boy living with his grandparents in a trailer. So, for example, clothes and pots and toys clotted the floor of the galley kitchen. He pummeled the boy. He aped Larry. He lay in a hospital bed, webbed in tubing, bandages, and monitors. Number 12, avoid jargon. In this case, what I'm talking about is a tendency sometimes for writers to feel like if they use fancy words, they sound smarter. Don't do that. And also, I think one of the problems, particularly in writing nonfiction and in a more journalistic form, this happens when you have been deeply immersed in a subculture, whether it's a story you're writing about a Silicon Valley startup, or whether it's a story you're writing about a court case or the police or whatever it is, a medical story. Sometimes listening to all the jargon of that subculture means that it begins to creep into your own writing in a way that I think obscures rather than enlightens readers. So here's some examples of that. So never say things like utilize when use will do. Never say individual when person will do. And again, cops like to use this a lot. And I find with cop reporters, that term sort of slips into their prose all the time. Never say juvenile when child or teen will do. And again, never adopt that insular language of the institution you're writing about, because it is designed to separate us and them and to exclude. One example of educational jargon I have right here, quote, we need to take data points to determine if there has been a response to the intervention. Terrible sentence. So just to wind things up, I'm going to undercut everything I just said and say that plenty of the best writers out there break these rules all the time. But again, do that when you have a reason to do that, and only do it occasionally so that it carries a kind of emphasis that you want. Here's some examples. I want you to guess who these writers are. So a little personal quiz here at the end to see if you recognize these greats. So this first sentence, there were so many different moods and impressions that he wished to express in verse. He felt them within him. He tried to weigh his soul to see if it was a poet's soul. Any thoughts? That would be James Joyce again. So perhaps you are starting to recognize that as he's come up a couple times in this. Here is another one. He came to Lorton with a ready-made reputation. Since Moultrie Wilson and Tony Cathedral, first-degree murderers both, and destined to die there, knew him from the Northwest and Northeast days. They were about as big as you could get in Lorton at that time. The guards called Lorton the House of Moultrie and Cathedral, and they let everyone know that Caesar was good people, a protected body, with no danger of having his biscuits or his butt taken. Any thoughts on that one? A more contemporary writer? That's a sentence by Edward P. Jones, DC novelist extraordinaire. And last, I'm giving you a great big hint with this one. That a famous library has been cursed by a woman is a matter of complete indifference to a famous library. That one would be Virginia Woolf, pictured here. Here is a few more. It was like certain dinners I remember from the war. There was much wine, an ignored tension, and a feeling of things coming that you could not prevent happening. War writer, anyone? That would be Ernest Hemingway. Next sentence, full bosomed, proud, and of no mean size, she would launch herself down the street like a ship under full sail, usually pulling me stumbling behind her. Not too many hardy souls dared cross her prow too closely. Again, notice that use of the "to" twice. Thoughts on that one? That would be Audre Lorde. This last one, Rose would get all round thinking, her eyes, her head, her mouth, her hands. She would get all round while she was thinking. And then to relieve her hearing, her thinking, she would sing. That would be Gertrude Stein. So again, with the repetition. So in that first sentence, there's Hemingway using there was, and it's fine, it works. There's Audre Lorde with the repetition of to, and working beautifully. And then of course, Gertrude Stein, where the repetition is very, very clearly intentional and artful. So that is the end of my top 12 tips on how to improve your prose.